Get started and welcome everybody today. I'm Rachel Schwam. I'm Associate Director with the Rutgers Energy Institute, and I'm going to be introducing Jennie Stevens today. And I'd like to thank Kevin Keys, who's our graduate student assistant working with the Rutgers Energy Institute to help set up these talks this fall. And if you can see your screen, there's a number of policy talks coming up. The next one being the 30th of October with Dalia Patino Echeverry for Duke University, and talking about photovoltaics and kind of using computer algorithms to manage power plants. So I'd like to introduce and give a really warm welcome to Jennie Stevens, who came to Rutgers maybe 4 or 5 years ago now and gave a talk on, I think, her previous book. But Jennie is now the Dean's Professor of Sustainability, Science and Policy at Northeastern School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Her research, teaching, and community engagement focus on social and political aspects of the renewable energy transition and responses to climate change. Her research focuses on institutional and cultural innovation in the energy sector, including gender diversity and energy democracy and technological optimism and the usability of climate science and climate mitigation and adaptation. Jennie's here to talk to us today about her brand new book that, I don't know, when I looked it up, came out maybe the 17th of this month. So we're getting her nice and early. And her book is Diversifying Power: Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist on Climate and Energy. And so thank you, Jennie, so much for giving us this talk. We're really happy to have you here.
Great. Well, thank you all. Great to be here, and a special thank you to Rachel and Bob Kopp, also another colleague that I know well at Rutgers, and other folks. Let me just pull up my presentation here. And hopefully today's presentation will offer some optimism in a time when, you know, we're in a really dire place in so many ways right now in the United States, not just with the climate crisis, obviously on top of the pandemic, the health crisis, the economic crisis, and then we have systemic racism and all the disparities that are being showcased in all of these crises. So I wrote this book, and my focus today is really going to be about the importance of anti-racist feminist leadership on climate and energy. Coming from a perspective, I've worked on climate and energy now for 2 decades, my whole career really. And I have a science and engineering background, so I've come at these issues the way many of us have, from a kind of technical perspective. And what I've realized is that we have been underappreciating, underinvesting, not paying enough attention to the social change, social justice, and social innovations that need to happen for us to address the climate crisis effectively. And that requires us to acknowledge and embrace the interconnections of all of these crises that I just mentioned, and really work toward a transformation that's bigger than anything that most of us are focusing on in our research, that tends to be like a specific piece of the puzzle. So actually, I'm just gonna turn, the sun is shining down on me, so let me just change that a little bit. Hopefully that's a little better. So to begin, I wanted to just introduce myself and my own background. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Dublin, Ireland. My family first moved to Boston when I was 8. And I mentioned this career trajectory just to kind of give you a sense of how I see these issues coming together. And I was very early on aware that I wanted to focus on environmental issues, and I got my undergraduate degree at the interface of science and policy. Then I did my PhD and my graduate work in very technical engineering, environmental science and engineering. And then for a postdoc, came back to Cambridge and worked on energy technology innovation. So thinking more about policy and how policy influences our energy perspectives. My first faculty position was at Clark University, where I was for 9 years, which is an hour west of Boston, where I focused on the social and technical dimensions of energy and climate. I was then a faculty member at the University of Vermont for a couple of years, where I focused on the renewable energy transformation in Vermont and with a focus kind of regional innovations there. And then I've been at Northeastern for the past 4 years, where I've had an opportunity to focus more explicitly on policy and kind of this intersectional approach to thinking about energy and climate. So I propose in the book that the climate crisis is a crisis in leadership. And I don't just mean, the president level, national leadership. I mean leadership at all different levels. And one of the things that I propose is that we have been thinking about climate change in isolation of other issues, and all too often it has been presented to the public as a separate problem, a problem that is kind of something that we don't necessarily wake up every day worrying about, and it's been approached in a very technocratic way. And a lot of the solutions to climate change that have been put forth are also kind of technological solutions and a kind of technocratic perspective that has missed opportunities for connecting with people. It's missed opportunities to connect with jobs and economic justice issues, connecting with housing and education and food and our health, right? So much of the climate crisis is impacting our health, and there are huge health disparities associated with climate and energy. Yet that isn't the way that a lot of our policies and our proposals and discourse around this has happened. So I propose that this climate isolationism framing, which continues today, but has been ineffective in part because people thought of climate change as like a separate issue that we don't really have time to deal with because we have all these more urgent things to worry about. So an alternative framing that I think is increasingly powerful, especially right now in the United States, is this framing of energy democracy. And that vision, that social movement and kind of vision of the future is really acknowledging we need to move away from fossil fuel-based society to a renewable-based society. And when we do that, we have a lot of opportunities to invest in people and communities that will simultaneously address so many other social problems that we have right now in this country. So it's really a vision of policies based on social justice and human dignity, and leveraging this urgency for transformation toward a more renewable-based society to help all kinds of other issues, including economic injustices, racial injustices, and health disparities. And the vision of energy democracy is really a renewable-based future in which we have distributed power, literally and figuratively. Renewable-based future isn't just solar or wind, depending on where different communities and regions. If you're close to the coast, we might have tidal and wave energy as well as offshore wind. If you're inland, you might have solar and wind, but also some geothermal energy. Or other possibilities. So, the energy democracy vision also has multiple scales, right? We could have household energy, community-owned energy, regional energy systems, as well as large-scale power plants that could be large wind or solar or geothermal or whatever. So the vision here is that by moving away from our traditional fossil fuel-based energy system toward a renewable-based energy system, we have an opportunity to redistribute power literally and figuratively. And there, I mean, not just the electricity itself, but also the social and political power that the energy companies have accumulated over the past few decades. So that brings me to this next point about economic injustice. And we don't think necessarily about energy and climate in terms of economic injustices in this country, but they're intricately linked. The widening income and wealth gaps in the United States is a fundamental problem that requires big transformation. We can't, if you look here in the past 40 years, the top 1% in terms of income, the share of national income has increased considerably, and wealth, the gap is even bigger in terms of the top 1% and the lower 90%. So this means we have systemic problems, and this is going to continue unless we have big transformation. So we need to acknowledge that this is unsustainable. This is not good for anybody. This is why we are in the position where we're in right now, where we have these interconnected crises. And despite being a wealthy country with lots of investments in research, and we know the science, we are completely ill-prepared right now to deal with what we have in front of us. The health crisis, the climate crisis, the economic crisis, and the racial injustices that are so systemic in our society. So this is kind of the case for why we need big transformation, and we have the opportunity to connect that with our energy system change. I want to highlight this idea of a polluter elite. And the polluter elite are shareholders, fossil fuel interests, wealthy individuals and organizations that are profiting from our fossil fuel infrastructure. The polluter elite want to continue this concentration of wealth and power that's showed on this figure. So they don't want us to change. They don't want us to move toward a renewable future. So there have been strategic investments for decades to resist the transformation that we could be accelerating. So among the ways that the polluter elite have been strategically investing to resist change are this decades-long misinformation campaign to deny climate science that has been very effective. And we still have, you know, many people in the country who are culturally now skeptical and don't believe the science of climate change. We've the same actors, including like the Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, and other members of the polluter elite have collaborated in investing in undermining public trust in government and minimizing worker protections and worker rights. So there's been a corporate shift in culture whereby the shareholders' interests are prioritized over the workers' interests, and that has also, you know, been going on for decades, undermining American workers. So the premise of the book and the idea here is to acknowledge the different leadership styles that we have, and really focus on the opportunities for elevating anti-racist and feminist leadership. And here I just want to explain what I mean by anti-racist and feminist leadership, which is really based on collaboration, inclusivity, and participation. There's a lot of empathy and kind of compassion for what people and communities need. That is part of that anti-racist feminist leadership. It's also about distributing wealth and power, and prioritizes that investments in communities and workers' rights are actually good for everybody, not just those who could benefit. It's also focused on reducing inequities and disparities by centering social and racial justice, and leveraging transformation by linking these problems, not keeping transportation and housing and jobs separate from climate and energy, but figuring out how these are actually interconnected. And when we connect these problems, they're more tractable, and we can come up with bigger transformative changes. So obviously the squad is an example of 4 junior congresswomen who have come into the national leadership roles that they have taken, and they have changed the public discourse. They have collaborated to really elevate a lot of these connections with climate and energy and other issues, including economics, jobs, housing, transportation, food, and others. So the Ayanna Pressley, who's the representative of where I am here in Massachusetts, says, you know, anyone who's focused on social justice can be part of the squad. It's not an elite group. It's actually a very inclusive group. And it's really a different way of thinking about what we need in society. And obviously we have the other side of more traditional patriarchal leadership that really has been dominated and continues to be dominated by white men. And it really focuses on concentrating wealth and power, exacerbating inequities and racial disparities by denying all of these problems. Denying the climate crisis, denying systemic racism and racial injustices, denying the fact that we have an economic crisis, and even denying that we right now have a major health crisis with the pandemic. So there's a lot of opportunity here to just call it out, these different forms of leadership, and support anti-racist and feminist leadership. And I will just say, anybody, regardless of your gender identity or your racial identity, can embrace anti-racist feminist leadership. So what I want to do with just the remaining time, and I'm looking forward to opening this up for questions, is just kind of go through a few of the key points that I elevate in the book, and some of the leaders, because what the book ended up being is really elevating stories of really innovative, inspiring leaders that many of us don't hear about, right? And that we have an opportunity to be motivated by hearing their stories. So Jackie Patterson is the director of NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and she is among a group of leaders that I talk about in the book who have really been resisting the polluter elite. I mentioned this powerful group, kind of the 1% who have really been profiting over our fossil fueled energy system. And what Jackie Patterson and others have been doing is elevating how the fossil fuel interests have actually been manipulating communities of color, particularly Black communities, to kind of buy their support for continued fossil fuel investments, and dismissing the health disparities and negative impacts that those communities have experienced from the fossil fuel infrastructure. Another leader that I mention is Jasmine Banks, who's the executive director of Uncoke My Campus, which is an organization that focuses on how the Koch brothers and the Koch Foundation and other allies associated with have been, including other fossil fuel interests, have been coordinated in their efforts to infiltrate our educational organizations, our campuses, our universities, and also some of our courts and our justice system as well. And so this work of actually revealing, in an effort to resist the influence and this concentration of wealth and power of the polluter elite, is really important work. Maura Healey is the Attorney General here in Massachusetts. She is another example of a lawyer who is advocating for the people and resisting the polluter elite in terms of being a leader and bringing some of these court cases against the fossil fuel interests, particularly ExxonMobil, in terms of their campaigning and advertising for their products in kind of a greenwashing way, to say which is she's calling out as an unjust practice. So another set of leaders are leaders who are really connecting jobs and economic justice with the climate and energy opportunities and challenges that we're facing. Varshini Prakash is one of the co-founders of the Sunrise Movement, who the Sunrise Movement, I think it's very hard to underestimate how effective and influential the youth movement has been in the past couple of years. And a lot of that has to do with the leadership really working in a very inclusive, collaborative, and building momentum and a movement in a very broad coalition way that has been really impactful. And obviously the Sunrise Movement has been critical in elevating and working in collaboration with the leaders who have been elevating the Green New Deal Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of course, and Senator Ed Markey are among the leaders that have first to propose the Green New Deal. And obviously now there's a lot of work being done to prepare for and figure out what specific policies and can fit within that framework. There are a whole other set of leaders that are, again, focusing on this jobs and economic justice piece of climate and energy. I'll just name a few. Grid Alternatives is a workforce training and solar installation organization that is training people around the country in solar installation jobs. Esteban Kelly is the head of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, who's thinking about alternative cooperative model for business and connecting that with climate and energy work. And Rowena Altmos is one of the leaders in All In Energy, which is an organization here in Boston that is also doing workforce training and energy efficiency, and making sure that communities that have been excluded from a lot of the energy efficiency work are being trained, and then they also are able to take advantage of the state and national programs in energy efficiency. So all of these leaders are resisting the kind of the precarity of the economic systems that has just been getting worse and worse for communities and households around the country. They've also been reclaiming kind of the positive potential of public investment and really thinking about restructuring our systems for more inclusive prosperity. So there's also a whole set of leaders who are focused on health, well-being, and nutritious food for all, and connecting that with climate and energy. Robert Bullard is the father of environmental justice, who's among the first to really point out the health disparities and toxic exposures that a lot of Black communities have been facing associated with fossil fuel infrastructure. Mildred McLean is the Harambee House Citizens for Environmental Justice. She's been, saying that her communities are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and really elevating the racial disparities in health related to energy systems. We have Gina McCarthy, who's the currently head of NRDC, but prior was the head of the EPA under Obama's administration. And she's really been one of the leaders to elevate the connections with health and climate and health, and really pointing out that when we elevate the real impacts of climate change are mostly health impacts, is a really good way to get more people to be concerned and take seriously the climate crisis. Jillian Heshaw is an attorney and a Black advocate lawyer for Black farmers, and she works on connecting climate and energy with food access and agriculture. Then we have leaders like Mustafa Santiago Ali, who is an advocate for elevating all of the harms and risks to communities of color around the country when it comes to climate change. And Dorcetta Taylor, who has elevated the whiteness of our environmental movement and our energy and climate policy, and in a way that really elevates the possibilities for and the critical importance of diversifying our environmental movements to address a lot of these health disparities. And I mention here Jacinda Ardern, of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, as another example of the kind of leadership that we need in terms of with the pandemic. New Zealand, along with other countries that are run by women, including Taiwan, Denmark, Germany, other examples, where their effectiveness in managing the pandemic has been elevated as among the best in the world. And a lot of it has to do with being very focused on the science and the evidence and making decisive, strict measures, and then following that up with very direct communication and compassionate perspective on why and the collective of why we need to take these measures for the good of society. And this kind of collective and empathetic perspective and being able to communicate that has really been some of the characteristics that seem to be most important. And some of that is related to climate as well, because there's been new research also that shows that countries with more women leaders often have stronger climate policies as well. So I want to also connect this with transportation. And obviously, transportation is a really interesting case because so many of us have been thinking about transportation with climate and energy. And all too often, though, it gets down to thinking about electric vehicles and the Tesla, right? Which is a very technocratic way of thinking about transportation. Our car-based culture, thinking about kind of just a simple technological substitution from a fossil fuel individual vehicle to a electric individual vehicle. And there's clearly a lot of space for vehicle technological innovations, and I don't mean to dismiss that in any way. But what I want to point out here is that the transportation innovations that we've been investing in have been very much on the technical side, and we have not been investing as much in thinking about deeper systems changes in how we think about transportation, how we invest and support transportation, how we think about public transit, how we think about transit related development, how we think about, you know, reconfiguring communities so people can walk and bike and take public transit rather than rely on the individual vehicle. So some of the leaders in this space, Ayanna Presley has been leading the national caucus on transportation, and in her campaign here in Massachusetts, she has transportation and mobility of communities around the Boston area in particular has been a focus of her work and her bringing the social justice lens to thinking about transportation. Michelle Wu is a Boston City Councilor who just announced her plan to run for mayor of Boston, and she has proposed a Green New Deal for Boston that includes free public transit for everyone. And this idea of investing and financing public transit in a way that is free opens up the possibilities and acknowledges that so many of our transportation systems are actually perpetuating inequities and disparities, because it's the same amount for anybody to ride the T in Boston, whether you're on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum or the high end. So it really ends up being a regressive situation where if and when public transit was financed differently and was actually made accessible for people, it could be a mechanism by which to open up opportunities for people rather than close them off. And in this area of transportation, I also just mentioned briefly Greta Thunberg, obviously during her time last year coming over to North America for the climate meetings that she attended. She very intentionally, you know, took boat transport rather than airplane transport and made a big statement about transportation. And obviously with the pandemic, all of our mobility needs are being questioned, and our need to commute and as well as this global travel has all been reduced, so that there's a lot of opportunities for shifts in our transportation expectations moving forward. I also just connect this with housing. We are in a housing crisis in the United States that I don't know if everyone is aware of, but with the impending evictions that are about to happen on top of an already very so many people having housing insecurity, connecting the housing crisis with climate and energy is fundamental. And another member of the squad, Ilhan Omar, has really been very outspoken about the need for big public investments in housing. And when we connect those investments with thinking about energy efficiency and zero energy or net zero buildings, we can see a lot of opportunities for climate and energy advancement along those lines as well. So I also want to just mention in Oakland, there was this past spring or last year, I guess, this eviction crisis and a specific incidence of 4 moms who are homeless who occupied a vacant house, and they were evicted, and they refused to leave at the first notice. And there was actually a military tanks and these armed men sent in to evict them in the middle of the night in January. So this, what I'm showing that because they have now responded to that and has elevated the inequities and disparities of housing and the housing crises that, particularly in California, but around the country, where we are just under investing in and putting people in such precarious situations with regard to housing, and we don't seem to have a plan in place, and this is just going to continue to get worse, especially now with the pandemic and additional economic insecurities and economic crisis. The final example here is about the tiny house warriors, which are Indigenous women in Canada that are resisting the transnational pipeline going across across Canada, a fossil fuel pipeline, with their building of their own tiny houses that are actually on wheels, and they can move to different places as part of their protest for their right to the land, and which they consider their home. And it's another fossil fuel resistance example that connects directly with housing. So I want to end by just saying that the book, by elevating the stories of these inspirational and motivating leaders, the goal really is to elevate our collective power and acknowledge the potential here for larger transformation. And a lot of the ways we can all help, we are all leaders in different ways, right? In our organizations, in our communities, in our families. And it's not just, this book isn't just about political leaders. So we can all be leading to act and inspire other leaders. We can be advocating for bigger systems change. The problems that are so interconnected that I've tried to articulate here really require deep transformative change. We can't tweak around the edges anymore or advocate for small incremental changes. We really need bigger systems change. We have to also acknowledge and understand and talk about and unlearn racism and sexism, which has been so embedded in so many of our practices and our organizations and our policies. And we need to obviously get out the vote and help others to vote and engage with our elected officials, really prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion in every aspect of everything we do is part of it, and advocating for local community renewable energy in wherever you live. Also, we want to continue to leverage data, science, and information for change, and support cooperatives and novel economic structures. And there's a lot of potential for change here. And I think one other thing that we, obviously with such a divided country right now, we want to be elevating, connecting across the divide and listening and learning from each other, and really trying to emphasize that the principles of anti-racist feminist leadership, although they've been politicized, and they are really about putting people first, and what do people need, and what do we need as a country if we want a just and equitable and prosperous future for everybody. And that's kind of a call for all of you who might be interested in thinking about energy issues, to broaden your horizon and broaden the connections that your work on energy and your interest in energy has to all of these other issues. And I mentioned just Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president in 1972. Her slogan was "Unbought and Unbossed," and continues to be an inspiration for so many people. And Mary Robinson, who's the former president of Ireland, who's also famous for the quote, "Climate change is a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution." So with that, I will end and open it up for questions. I will just mention my book is out, and all the proceeds from the book, all my author proceeds, are going to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. They're doing amazing work, and hopefully the message of the book is inspiring and helping all. The goal is really to help all of us figure out how we can connect what we're passionate about and the work that we're doing with some broader multiracial, multi-generational coalitions to work toward larger systems change for the better for everybody. So I will end it there, and I'd be happy to take questions.
If anyone has any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to ask away.
So if nobody else has a question, Jenny, I'll ask you. So I have a copy of your book. I haven't finished reading it, but sounds great. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you view as the role of academic institutions in advancing an anti-racist feminist climate agenda.
Yeah, so a couple different things. One is in our research, we can definitely be integrating issues of social justice and being aware to the social justice implications. So much of our energy policy so far has actually been, benefiting people on the higher socioeconomic spectrum and excluding and inadvertently leaving others out. So I think that's a big piece of what we can all do is integrate consideration of this in everything that we're doing. The other piece, of course, is access to higher ed and training students to think about these issues. And one of my colleagues recently mentioned that, once you see the injustices and the systemic injustices, it's hard to unlearn that and not see it everywhere you look. So we do have a role. Historically, a lot of our universities have not been elevating or acknowledging a lot of these systemic problems. Particularly both with race and gender. So elevating that and opening up and helping people be able to talk about and acknowledge and in a productive way. And as I said, anti-racist feminist leadership, everyone can embrace that. It's not a specific, it's a very inclusive and opening positionality, and so there's a lot that we can do in higher ed to help with that. I guess the other piece with climate and energy in particular, I think pushing back against the very technocratic, scientifically oriented perspective all the time. Obviously that's really important, and I'm not diminishing the importance of climate science and in terms and technological advancements in addressing the climate crisis and energy. But we really have been missing out on opportunities for a more inclusive approach by not investing and prioritizing and elevating social science work in this space that is focused on social justice and social change. So there's so much innovation to happen necessary, that there's so much research to do and research to action links when we are able to do more inclusive research.
So I have a question. Can I ask a question? Is so what do man and woman tend to think differently about climate and energy?
So the focus on gender and anti-racist perspective in leadership on climate and energy is really acknowledging that we all bring our experiences to our work, right? We bring our life experiences, we bring the struggles we've had and the successes we've had to what we think is most important. So when women and people of color enter into leadership spaces where they've been historically excluded, they think about different issues and they're able to center social justice issues in a way that have not been elevated before. So that is one piece of it. The other piece has to do with risk perceptions. There's been some research on gendered risk perceptions and also racial risk perceptions in the United States. White men have had a lot of privileges, and they have on average, they think a lot of things are less risky. And so therefore they prioritize different things in terms of consequences. So there is a gendered and a racial difference in risk perception that is based on our different experiences that we bring. So you know, there's not a line down the middle that, you know, all men do this and all women do that. It's more about having diversity in perspectives, and also having a difference of different priorities and different perspectives brought to the innovation space. Because if we have a whole bunch of people, you know, there's a lot of research on innovation, and the more diverse groups come up with better, more effective ideas oftentimes too, because they're thinking outside the box. If we're among people that we're all from the same background and the same upbringing, we are less innovative, right? So there are multiple dimensions to why the representation is important. And the flip side is that men and white people can also embrace anti-racist feminist leadership, right? Like it's not actually based on who you are to prioritize these considerations.
Thank you.
We have a question from the chat that I'll ask. What are you doing along with Rutgers and other colleagues to consolidate the holding of the leadership you speak today? Is it clear to your environmental science colleagues that they become allies and advocates of this leadership? What can we do to make this clear?
Yeah, great question. And I think what I'm coming to realize more and more, and I think other people are too, is with systemic racism as an example. If we ignore it, we are perpetuating it, right? And I think that's the same can be held for gender discrepancies and discrimination. If we say, oh, well, I know, you know, I have some Black colleagues who are doing just fine, therefore there isn't a racism problem in the United States, you know, we're ignoring it and we're denying it. And then if we assume that all of our systems are fine, then we are perpetuating and encouraging it. So I think part of what needs to happen, and I think this is starting to happen more and more, especially right now with the pandemic revealing so many disparities that many of us were very familiar with before, but we're realizing how important it is, you know, for everybody, that everybody has some basic infrastructure and support and prosperous future. When people are left out and excluded, and it's bad for everybody. It's not just bad for the people who are left out, right? It's actually, we're missing out on so much that we could have in terms of a more productive and compassionate society if we didn't have such drastic disparities here. So I think what we can do in our universities, obviously universities are challenging places because we as institutions are also quite elitist, right? Like not everybody gets in, it's very expensive to go. So only certain people are getting access to the privilege of being in a university setting and exploring these issues with the freedom that we all have to explore these issues. So that's where, I mean, I think there's a lot we need to do in changing our university culture as well. And again, I've seen in my own university, at least, you know, in the past few months, really a much more explicit acknowledgement of changes that we need to make internally, and connections among the different challenges that society is facing, and wanting to be, you know, this phrase of being on the right side of history, or it's more than that. It's actually, with what I started with, if we ignore these issues, we are denying them and we are actually perpetuating them. So that's where it's really important in everything we do, every decision we make, every investment we make, we need to be thinking about the social justice implications. And it's hard because a lot of our work has been, you know, that isn't how we've been trained to prioritize what we do. So it is a big shift that's starting to happen more and more. And hopefully conversations like this will help.
Hi, Jenny. Lorenzo Christoph. This is really fascinating, and thank you for this contribution identifying people who are doing great stuff. I'm working in the field of trying to advance community energy, coming back to that idea. How do we create local energy resources that could be locally owned, create greater resilience, local economic opportunities, and so on. And what I keep seeing as a major challenge to all of that is the regulatory commissions, the way they make decisions, the way they compartmentalize activities into multiple proceedings. I'm wondering who you might see or where you might see regulatory commissions that are doing some innovative things along the lines of what you're suggesting. Are there people working in that realm to actually help change the processes to make them more inclusive and participatory?
Yeah, great question. And I think one of the things when we think about, you know, the possibilities for local and community energy, we do need to think of the full regulatory structure, right? And there's steps, you know, possibilities for innovation along the way. And really for big transformative change to happen, there needs to be alignment with the different regulatory scale, right? At the national level, and then the state, and then local, and ideally international as well, right? And so alignment with these different pieces of the puzzle are key. I think I actually don't know a specific example of innovation within regulatory commissions, although I'm sure there are some. I didn't end up emphasizing or elevating particular stories in that realm, but I do know that the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Group is doing a lot of work with energy justice, and thinking about and trying to influence at different levels these changes and innovations that you have mentioned. And I think identifying the bottlenecks or some of the key antiquated ways of regulating the energy system are a particularly important piece, and a lot of it is kind of hidden, like people aren't very familiar with how these decisions are being made and how the power that the regulatory commissions and the existing structure has, and on how it constrains what can happen. And so that's where a lot more attention and research and you know, spotlight on those specific kinds of areas are really important, because without that, as you said, things can get jammed up pretty quickly because of some of these very kind of traditional ways of thinking.
We have another question from the chat. Climate and economic justice often falls to community-based groups that are often under-resourced. What could a partnership look like between CBOs, government, utilities, and/or technologists that can advance climate leadership in a more balanced way?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm optimistic about the Green New Deal as a whole new framework, right? Where we can start to make some of these connections, and in an inclusive, coalition-based way that acknowledges and actually invests more in the underserved, underrepresented, and communities that have been marginalized and excluded so far, right? And you know, that's where this idea even of reparations has been integrated into some of the discussions about the Green New Deal. It's not just that we need to invest in jobs and renewable installation, you know, with a big, massive public investment. It matters very much how those investments are allocated and who gets to benefit the most, and who, how those are distributed, those resources are distributed. And that's where, you know, it's very compelling to think about that the communities that have been excluded historically for so long are the communities that should be prioritized in these public investments, rather than the other way around, the way it's been so far, with a lot of advances in energy technology innovation, where the subsidies have gone to well-off families and households and individuals and communities who've benefited, and then they have played a role in demonstrating the technology works and things like that. But in terms of the energy burden of low-income households who pay a much higher percentage of their total income toward energy, those are the households that really should be benefiting from the subsidies. So I think there's optimism in thinking about the Green New Deal framework to respond to that, and other social innovations as well.
Another question from the chat. We focus on the fossil fuel corporations. How can we bring focus to the military as a polluter with huge carbon footprint and bring the peace movement into this discussion of system change and moving money to human needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I saw recently analysis of how much public support goes to military spending, right? And if we were able to reprioritize that, we could go a long way in a lot of these problems. So I think that is part of anti-racist feminist leadership. The emphasis on military funding and brute force kind of control, patriarchal leadership that is associated with an emphasis on military might at all, to be prioritized over all other needs, is a traditional lens of leadership. And I think with a more broad, inclusive, holistic, people's first approach, those discrepancies on how much we're spending on these different categories seem very unpractical, and more than that, I mean, not effective in so many levels. So I think there's a lot to be said there in terms of the emphasis on our public spending for the military, and I agree that that's a big piece of the transformation that could happen.
Another question here. Is it not the case that the pouring of money into military policing is deliberate to bankrupt the building of a just, abundant society? Pretty deep question.
Yeah, so, a lot of big picture macro perspectives would agree with that for sure, that we have been investing with this very militaristic, high police force approach, while under-investing in community services and social services. And that's part of the problem, that police then have to deal with problems that nobody else is dealing with, right? And they're completely ill-equipped to deal with many of these problems. So yes, I think that there's a reprioritization across the board in terms of what we're funding and how we're funding and what's the priority. And I think that the narrative of fear and therefore we need protection and control over people has perpetuated this, and it is definitely antithetical to the goal of a more equitable and prosperous future for all, which requires different kinds of investments for sure.
All right, any last questions? Maybe one more before we wrap up.
I guess I would just end on one other initiative that we're trying to work on at Northeastern is thinking about the university's role and the university's climate action plan, or you know, our own role as a demonstrating innovative approaches to some of these issues. And one of the things some students in my class are working on this semester is, can we come up with a climate justice action plan for the university rather than a climate action plan? In that, what does it mean to not just focus on the carbon accounting and decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission goals, which is the traditional way of thinking about it, but integrating the social justice piece into planning at different scales. And so I don't have all the answers for that, what that would look like, but I think it's an exercise, and increasingly some cities are doing that. The city of Providence in Rhode Island is the first city that actually has a climate justice plan rather than a climate action plan. And they have centered social justice and racial justice and economic justice at the forefront of their climate planning for the city. So I think that's a novel way to be thinking about how to, for those of us focused on climate, to connect with other issues.
Great, thanks, Jenny. And I'll put in, I know Bob's on the call, but Rutgers is working on our climate action plan right now, and each of the working groups does have a section of how this, you know, intersects with climate justice and those considerations. So we haven't oriented it completely around that, but certainly are trying to integrate it into the climate action planning. Well, with that, I'd really like to thank Jenny for this talk and this perspective, and wrap this up. As Kevin noted in the chat, as Kevin noted in the chat, this will be posted on the REI website, and we actually are going to ask Jenny maybe if she can share her slides, since some of them were cut off, and so that we can kind of add those to the package. But with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful Friday and weekend, and thank you, Jenny, for your time and sharing your knowledge.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was great to have a chance to speak with all of you, and good luck with the rest of the semester.